Well, it's hard to follow Pedro. I'll try to do my best. So I was asked to pick 5 top publications from the last year. It's a difficult exercise to do in a field such as HIV and aging. So I said, what am I going to do? So I did a PubMed search. That's the first place to start. And looked only at published paper, not conference presentations, from September 2017 and September 2018. And then I figured, okay, so there are so many, how do I select? So I figured I would pick some on each class of scientific pillar and try to find the few paper that caught my interest. And I specifically excluded papers from topics that I knew would be covered by the other presenters today. So I knew there were presentations on microbiome, neurocognitive, and everything. So that's how I got to it. So let's start with the couple of papers in epidemiology related to HIV and aging. So this is the paper that was recently published on the new HIV diagnosis among adults aged 50 years or older in 31 European countries from 2014 to 2015 by Tavoshi and et al. And it's the EU EEA HIV surveillance network. So it's an observational analysis of surveillance data to identify trends. And the study population for this particular paper was all individuals aged 5 years or older who were newly diagnosed with HIV between January 1st, 2004 and December 31st, 2015, reported as part of the surveillance. And it was case-level anonymized data that were reported for each new diagnosis, and it includes demographic data and stage of disease and migration status. And older, please stay on your seat, is defined as 50 years or older. So that's what we have to live with. Okay. So of the 29,400 new cases that were reported in 2015, 5,017.3% were in older people at the table. So new HIV diagnosis among older people was 2.5 per 100,000 as opposed to 10.4 per 100,000, and the reported transmission route was significantly associated with age, with the higher proportion of cases attributed to heterosexual transmission in older people than in younger people. A higher proportion of older adults than of younger people were diagnosed late, with significantly lower median CD4 counts at diagnosis, and migration status was significantly associated with age, with older people were more likely to be native to the reporting country than younger people. So they did an analysis of which countries had seen increases in HIV diagnosis among older adults, and in 16 countries. I have listed them here. And only in one country was there a significant decrease in the new cases in older adults, and that was Portugal. The average annual notification rate of new diagnosis among older adults was 4.4 per 100,000 men and 1.2 per 100,000 women, so more in men than women. And although the main route of transmission was heterosexual, the notification rate increased significantly in both sexes, from 3.5 to 4.8 in men and 1 to 1.2 in women. And in younger people, there was a significant increase in new diagnosis in men and boys, and a significant decrease in women and girls. So take-home messages from that study is that there is an increasing trend in new diagnosis among older adults in the European countries. There are clear geographical patterns. I didn't go into all the details, but there is ups and downs depending on what you're surveying that differs among the countries. Older adults are a group at potential risk for HIV, and older individuals are likely to be diagnosed late across the region. So, and the most probable reason are low self-perception of risk and misconceptions or scant knowledge about HIV that are frequently reported reasons for older adults not being tested. So this data points towards the compelling need to consider older adults as a relevant target for HIV prevention program, which is not something that we always think about. So that's the first paper I wanted to share with you. This is another epidemiologic paper. So it's a paper by DeConnick et al. And its non-AIDS mortality is higher among successfully treated people living with HIV compared with matched HIV negative control persons, a 15-year follow-up cohort study in Sweden. So it's ongoing debate whether the lifespan of successfully treated people living with HIV is comparable with that of the general population. The study was to compare all-cause mortality between HIV positive and HIV negative controlled person. There were 4,066 HIV positive matched against 8,702 negative controls according to age, sex, region of birth, and these are data from the Swedish National HIV Register and the Swedish Population Register. Their national HIV register is quite interesting because they capture everybody who's diagnosed with HIV from the onset and gather prospectively these data. So they covered a 15-year period. And to make a long story short, what they show is that after a 15-year follow-up period, successfully treated HIV positive people were found to be 3 times more likely to die when compared to HIV negative control. This is true at each stratum of follow-up that has been assessed. And a cause-specific hazard analysis was conducted to compare non-AIDS mortality rates between successfully treated HIV positive and HIV negative control. There were only 11 of 58 patients who died from an AIDS-related condition. And when you exclude AIDS-attributed mortality, still you see that there is an association of people, HIV-positive people are still 2.4 times more likely to die compared with HIV-negative person, and it was highly significant. And finally, the mortality by mode of transmission, mortality was higher among people who use drugs, but conducting a sensitivity analysis, stratifying for drug users, non-HIV positive, and there was still a 2-4 times more risk of dying than in HIV negative people. So even if you assess for the drug use, the risk was still there. So successfully treated HIV-positive people, however, had the 76 reduced risk of mortality compared with untreated and unsuccessfully treated HIV patient over a 15-year period. That would come to sense, but it's sometimes it's good to have the data to show it. So, take-home messages from this study. The increased risk of mortality after 3 and 4 years in this study contrasts with other cohorts where it has been seen that people living with HIV on ART with a baseline CD4 count above 350 had mortality rates comparable with the general population. It also contrasts with the Cohort study that followed HIV people on ART with CD4 count above 500 over a median of 3.5 years and found mortality rates similar to that of the general population. However, these other studies and also found that mortality was 4.2 times higher than the general population, with all people living with HIV were considered, and not only those who have achieved this high CD4 count. So this is important when we read these literature about life expectancy, that usually the conclusion are always when they consider, oh, if your viral load is suppressed and if you've reached CD4 count above a certain level, well, this does not represent the majority of the people living with HIV. And then this is just a paper that was out like 2 days ago, and that Alan kindly showed me, and this morning I added those 2 slides. It is quite an interesting study, a meta-analysis of the global burden of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease in people living with HIV. It should actually be in the next section. I kind of added the slides too quickly. So why is it so interesting? I didn't have time to review it in a lot of details, but it's the sample size. So they looked at 793,000 people living with HIV with a total follow-up of 3.5 million person years. So that's sample size. And the crude rate of cardiovascular disease was 61.8 per 10,000 person years. In comparison with individuals without HIV, the risk ratio for cardiovascular disease was 2.16. Over the past 26 years, the global population attributable fraction from cardiovascular disease attributable to HIV increased from 0.36% to 0.92%, and DALYs increased from 0.74% to 2.57%. So this is the forest plot that shows the different studies that were retained for their analysis, and that you can see that the ratio, the risk ratio looks around twofold increased risk. There was also marked regional variation, with most DALYs lost in sub-Saharan Africa, and the highest population attributable fraction and burden were observed in Swaziland, Botswana, and Lesotho. So I think it's good to take time to read this paper in much more detail, which I hope I'll have time to do later on, but I think it is a convincing evidence that there is a definite association with cardiovascular disease and HIV. So now we go to clinical science. So a couple of study from Dr. Clotet and all of you have been involved with the EuroSIDA, aging and the evolution of comorbidities among HIV-positive individuals in the European cohort. So the goal is to describe the prevalence of comorbidities and risk factors. EuroSIDA, as you all know, is a multinational prospective cohort, collects data since 1994. Data is collected at 6 months interval. Epidemiological, demographic, C4 viral load are captured, and they compared 2 cross-sectional cohorts of HIV-positive adults under active follow-up, one in 2006 and then in 2014. Why they chose 2006, it was because it was at that time that they started collecting the creatinine data, and 2014 because they wanted to have current antiretroviral treatment. So 9,700 individuals were under active follow-up during 2006 and 12,000 during 2014, and 7,000 of those contributed to both cohorts. So the number of current smokers decreased from 51% to 44%. We're making some progress. There was the prevalence of risk factors and comorbidities generally increased in the older age group. There was a similar high prevalence of dyslipidemia, 70%, with the prevalence of diabetes increasing from 5.4 to 6.3%. In 2004, there was a small increase in the proportion of individuals who are overweight. Of course, this is Europe, it's not America. Things would be quite different. A large increase in the proportion of those with high blood pressure, 47 versus 60%, and the largest increase in prevalence was observed for chronic kidney disease, 4.1 to 6.9%, particularly in older individuals, where the proportion with kidney disease increased from 5.2 to 7.2 in the 50 to 60 year age group, and from 18 to 23% in those older than 60 years of age. And cardiovascular disease increased overall from 3.7 to 5%, with the highest prevalence in individuals aged 50 to 60 years and those above 60 years of age. So they did a univariate logistic regression modeling that showed that individual in the 2014 cohort had more than 2.5 higher odds of kidney disease compared to those in 2006. After adjusting for age group, the AOR for chronic kidney disease was 1.56. But after adjusting for other factors, including demographic, viral load, and CD4 count, HCV, smoking, etc., the year of the cohort was no longer associated with chronic kidney disease. So there's not a really increase over time. So older individuals had significantly increased odds of kidney disease, and after adjustment, women were twice as likely to have kidney disease compared to men. This is something that should be explored. Those with lower CD4 cell count had higher odds of kidney disease with high viral load, and individuals with low body mass index had a small but not significant increase in the odds for kidney disease, while those who were overweight or obese had lower odds for kidney disease. After adjusting for age group, the odds of kidney disease were similar in 2006 and 2014. And finally, for cardiovascular disease, the 2014 cohort had higher odds of cardiovascular disease, 1.88, and after multivariable adjustment for age group, gender, region of Europe, mode of infection, viral load, antiretroviral therapy, etc., the year of the cohort was not associated with cardiovascular disease. Older individuals had higher odds for cardiovascular disease, and women were less likely to have cardiovascular disease. And current and past smokers had higher odds compared to those who had never smoked, and the odds for cardiovascular disease were also increased among those with hypertension and diabetes and kidney disease. So nothing surprising in all of these data, but it characterizes our epidemic, and it emphasizes the care that we need, the attention that we must pay to all of these factors. And I will just take you to the last line. As persons are aging and living longer, careful consideration should be given to clinical management of the older person living with HIV who face additional risk associated with HIV infection, immunosuppression, inflammation, as well as effects of ARVs, and need to avoid drug interactions and polypharmacy. So that was discussed a little bit this morning. So frailty, neurocognitive impairment are both in predicting poor outcomes among adults living with human immunodeficiency virus. That was published in CID by Erlandson and colleagues. So this was an observational study of people living with HIV over 40 years of age who received randomized assignment of initial ART through the ACTG group and were followed prospectively in observational after their trial participation ended. It was 2013-2014. So they report data for the first 2 years. So they had questionnaires that went into quite a detail in terms of activities, daily activities, and falls, and frailty assessment was conducted. So of the 1,035 participants, 987 had both frailty and neurocognitive status assessed at baseline. So the data is based on these people. 4% were frail but didn't have any NCI, and 15% had NCI but no frailty, and 2% had both. And 79% had neither. So NCI was present in 11% of non-frail, 22% of pre-frail, and 32% of frail participants at baseline. So over 2 years of observation, 10% of participants experienced recurrent falls, 18% experienced worsening IADL limitations, and 2% died. 26% participants experienced at least one of these poor health outcomes. Poor health outcomes were most common among persons with both frailty and NCI, or with frailty without NCI. So anxiety, depression, medication change, the age-adjusted risk for the frailty without NCI exposure category by 10%, and therefore was excluded in the multivariable model. So in the models adjusted for anxiety and depression, the prevalence of a poor health outcome was 2.65 times greater among participants with both frailty and NCI compared to neither, and 2.26 times greater among participants with frailty but no NCI, and 1.73 times greater among participants with no NCI but no frailty. So it seems that the factor that is the most associated with bad outcome, that drives most of it, is the frailty more than the NCI. So again, authors had hypothesized that the combination of both frailty and NCI would be stronger than either alone. This is partially supported by the data. The association observed for both frailty and NCI was stronger than NCI alone, but not stronger than for frailty alone. So needs to assess frailty in all of our patients. Okay. Next study was the cardiovascular disease and use of contemporary protease inhibitors, the DAD, International Prospective Multi-Cohort Study. It's always interesting to follow their findings over the years. We have learned a lot from this cohort, and this was related to the use of protease inhibitor and cardiovascular disease. So of all the participants assessed, 1,157 with cardiovascular disease. During a median follow-up of 6.96 years, 1,000 participants had a cardiovascular event at an incidence rate of 5.34 events per 1,000 person year of follow-up. The crude CVD incidence rate progressively increased from 4.91 events per 1,000 years in individual never exposed to ritonavir boosted darunavir to 13.6 events per 1,000 years in individual exposed for more than 6 years. For ritonavir boosted atazanavir, the incidence rates also increased, although less, from 5 events to 6.68 events. But when you adjusted for potential confounders in the primary model, where factors on the potential causal pathway from ritonavir-boosted PI used to CVD were fixed at baseline, only the darunavir association remained significantly associated with cardiovascular disease, adjusted IRR of 1.59. The adjusted IRR for atazanavir was not significant. After additional adjustment with time-updated values for the factors that could potentially be on the causal pathway to CVD, it did not affect the overall association, suggesting that the association between darunavir, ritonavir, and CVD is not mediated by any of these factors, and most notably not by dyslipidemia. So the number needed to harm for ritonavir-boosted darunavir stratified by the underlying estimated 5-year cardiovascular risk was 533 people for those at low risk of CVD and 15 people for those at high risk of CVD. So there were different effects between different protease inhibitors, with atazanavir not being associated after adjustment for the confounding factors, and darunavir boosted associated with cardiovascular disease, and and because you don't see it with all of the protease inhibitors, the authors claim that it is not a drug class effect, but it is more likely to be specific to some protease inhibitor. Okay, so these were the clinical. I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to skip a few of those on the basic science to just accelerate the time. So I just wanted to faire un clin d'œil to my friend Alan Landay and his very nice review on the microbiome and HIV. I will not go into the details because microbiome has been discussed in length this morning, but just to make you aware of that this review exists, very well written and very easy to follow, and that the findings that were discussed this morning, you can find all the references in this review paper. I'm gonna just accelerate. Okay, one thing that caught my attention is that there were a few papers on the TAT and its role in various aspects of premature aging in the last year. This one, it was in the scientific report, and it related to the association of TAT with neurodegenerative phenotype with aging. So, in the central nervous system, HIV infects microglia and astroglia cells. Hiver, production of viral particles in astrocytes is restricted. However, there is a chronic production of non-structural proteins, such as NEF-REV and TAT, in astrocyte that is thought to contribute to neuronal dysfunction. So, this chronic low level of production of TAT has been proposed to contribute to neuronal damage over a prolonged period of time, but there was little evidence to support to this day. So they underwent to do a study in a transgenic mouse model that has a leaky tetracycline promoter system where they can play with the levels of TAT. And what they showed, to make a long story short, is that constitutive low-level TAT promoter activity is associated with structural modifications in the brain. Chronic low-level TAT expression is associated with synaptic change, and evidence for cytokine and cell stress in RTTA TAT mice were observed. And there was increased dentate gyrus volume that is associated with reactive gliosis. So they found a series of mechanisms by which TAT could create this, contribute to the neurodegeneration. During the same year, there are two other papers that I'm not going to discuss, but it has been shown that TAT alters neuronal intrinsic excitability. And there was another paper relating TAT to cardiovascular disease that I've listed here so that you, if you're interested, you may want to read. And finally, the last pillar of science, the social science. This is a Canadian paper. I thought I would at least put one Canadian paper in. It's unmet basic needs negatively affect health-related quality of life in people aging with HIV, and it is the results from the Positive Spaces, Healthy Places study. So they use a multiple linear regression model to examine the relationship between unmet basic needs and physical and mental quality of life by age strata. In a cross-sectional sample of 496 people living with HIV in Ontario, Canada. It was from this cohort that I just mentioned, and this is a 5-year observational cohort. 4 items on the 62-item questionnaire relating to food, clothing, housing, related costs, and risk of homelessness were analyzed. They particularly selected consciously a more vulnerable population out of their cohort to see if there were association. So an overwhelming majority of participants, 87%, reported unmet needs related to food, clothing, or housing. And the prevalence of unmet basic needs predicted substantially lower mean physical health and mental health summary scores in the 2 oldest group. So a majority of reported being unemployed, had been previously diagnosed with AIDS. The physical health summary score was low, and the health summary scores, mental health was depending on how you see it, was quite important. Role functioning scored the lowest, and the highest score was on the pain subscale. Significant difference among age categories with respect to gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity. Gay or bisexual male participants were older than females, same-sex or heterosexual participants. So fewer individuals in the middle age and the old age groups reported unmet basic needs than did those in the youngest group, but it was not statistically significant, and it did not differ by gender, ethnic group, or sexual preference. So participants without a high school degree or those with a job at the time of the interview were more likely to report unmet basic needs than their peers. Among those with personal gross income below $1,000 a month, the 2 older groups were less likely than the youngest group to report unmet needs. Same for unemployed or those who had finished high school. So it was associated with poor physical health and poor mental health. And the middle-aged group, the older group, unemployed individual, Caucasian, and those with a previous diagnosis of AIDS and with a longer duration since HIV diagnosis, all had significantly lower physical health summary scores. Being a female, unemployed, heterosexual, low social support, and a personal income below $1,000 a month were all significantly associated with lower mental health summary score. So unmet needs lowered physical health scores to a greater degree in the oldest group than they did in the middle-aged group. So I chose the study because we need to take our patients globally in a holistic way. Unmet basic needs were significantly and negatively associated with lower physical health and mental health. Even after controlling for potential confounders. There was very high prevalence of unmet needs. Age moderated the influence of unmet basic needs. Two older groups were well educated and enjoyed relatively high personal outcomes, so the association was not strong. The very high prevalence of unmet basic needs among people living with HIV have been magnified by the nature of the sample, which was purposefully recruited to represent a population with unstable housing. It did not differ by gender, race, or sexual orientation, which suggests that problems meeting basic needs is an across-the-board challenge for people living with HIV. So, you know, you think you're in a developed country, in Canada, and you still have 87% of the population who have trouble with food and with lodging and with these basic, so we're trying very hard to find cure and vaccine and everything, but food shouldn't be a bad idea. So these are the references for the study I presented. Thank you.